Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second round of cohort presentations and to our last general meeting of this year. So we have 7 presentations. Just to give you a quick overview, it'll be asset pricing, then game theory, the baseball part, and then development, the Brazil topic, development, the trade topic, the crime cohort, econ cohort, game theory, the misinformation portion, and then the policy and growth cohort. After each cohort goes, hopefully we'll have time for a little bit of discussion, but there are 7 cohorts or 7 presentations today, so we'll see what happens. If I've made you a co-host, that's because I've been informed that you will be sharing your slides for your presentation today. And if I have not yet done so, and you will be, give me a moment and I will get to it. But our first cohort is asset pricing. And so there's screen. And whenever you're ready, please begin. Just let me know whenever you want to change slides.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. We are the asset pricing cohort, and our project this year is measuring the ESG risk premia using various rating sources. And next, Alejandro will introduce us to the project.
So throughout this project, we had these main research questions guiding us. First, we wanted to identify if there was even an ESG risk premium. We also wanted to see how does the magnitude of the ESG risk premium vary when using ratings from different agencies, and are these risk premia correlated? Next slide. So before we can begin, we have to understand what exactly is ESG. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And these factors are supposed to measure how sustainable an investment is. At the heart of ESG investment is the simple idea that companies are more likely to succeed and deliver strong returns if they create value for all of their stakeholders, including the environment, not just the company owners. In the past 5 years, and especially after 2020, investors have really started to focus on ESG as a core investing theme. And see that after 2020, in the year 2020, there were 20 US-based ESG ETFs launched alone, showing a rapidly growing trend. One of the outstanding issues, however, for the strategy is standardization and consistent data sources. This field may start seeing regulation in the near future. Next slide. So what exactly is a risk premium and a farmer French? The only risks that investors should be compensated for are non-diversifiable risks. A risk factor is the underlying exposure to a certain type of risk that drives a portion of an asset's return. In short, it measures the degree of return investors are compensated for taking on this specific risk. Sharpe in 1964 posed the capital asset pricing model, which explains an asset's return by its covariance with the market. The Farmer French 3-factor model in 1992 for stock returns aggregates market value and size beta into a single function. Then, this Farmer French 3-factor model can also be used to decompose a portfolio's returns into that explained by the excess return of the market, a value factor, and size, by creating separate portfolios for each factor. Farmer French published a 5-factor model in 2014, which adds profitability and investment. Next slide. So ESG as a risk premium. It is proven to generate excess returns geographically and longitudinally for a diverse portfolio. ESG factors and consideration, when integrated into building a diverse portfolio, can generate alpha, or excess returns. The Pollard et al. Model in 2018 demonstrates that integration of ESG companies and factors into a benchmark portfolio will constantly outperform and generate higher returns compared to the benchmark risk-free portfolio. The Sharpe ratio of ESG integrated portfolios came out to be greater than 1.0, representing good excess returns, and demonstrate that ESG is an independent risk premium. Now, ESG-aligned megatrend portfolios. Nana and Fine in 2020 found that ESG megatrend integrated portfolios yielded a significant non-negative outcome, promoting both sustainable developmental goals while not sacrificing returns, even after accounting for transaction costs. They used stocks from the MSCI All-Country World Index. ESG risks can thus be diversified, and no extra costs are taken on for investors. The outperformance of the megatrend portfolio became statistically insignificant, however, after applying them to the pharma-friend 5-factor model. The ESG alignment of companies adds no idiosyncratic risk towards an asset.
Now, as we explained previously, we took our data mostly from these three sources, from Bloomberg, S&P Global, and Sustainalytics, three of which are different rating agency. They have their underlying methodologies, some of which are not necessarily expressed. Next slide, please. From these, we took the stock data from the CRSP, and we divided from the list of stocks, more than 100. We took 50 from the highest scoring ESG companies and 50 of the slowest ESG companies, and then assigned them to portfolios based on the weight, the magnitude of their positivity or negativity. So more in a, say, high ESG weighted portfolio, we put more value towards higher ESG weighted companies, right? Likewise for lower ESG values. Next slide, please. From then we kind of made portfolios, both long on high ESG, short at the same time as short on low ESG, then both independently long on high ESG, and then again long on low ESG, right? And then applied the 3-factor and 5-factor models to identify if there was any particular risk premium for each of these independent portfolios by the different rating agencies. Next slide, please. From here, we can see that the excess return are slightly but insignificantly negative, in less than, so these numbers excess returns are in percentages, so less than thousands, 10,000 of a percent. The only significant, I guess, results in terms of returns would be for the 3-factor and 5-factor alpha on Bloomberg, for the 5-factor alpha on Sustainalytics, and it's just slightly below significant for the 3-factor on Sustainalytics. Next slide, please. Then we ran 2 sample t-tests and excess returns in between these, each of these different ratings, to see if there was any significant difference from rating to rating in terms of, even if we don't understand what's the methodology behind it, is it affecting the returns? And from here, we can see that the values that are truly, there's an insignificance in the difference between these rating agencies. Next slide, please.
Great. So next we'll be getting into the visualizations portion of our presentation. And as you can see throughout the next couple of slides, we've essentially split them up into 2 different ones. First, as you can see, it's with Bloomberg and Sustainalytics only because they provide data over a span of 10 years, but our last data provider, S&P, only provides it from 2017 to 2019. So as you see through the next slides, we'll include that, but at least for the first one, going a little bit deeper into Bloomberg and Sustainalytics. As you can see with our total portfolio with the long high ESG rating companies and shorting the low ESG rating companies, the top 50 and the bottom 50 for each of these data providers, we have negative cumulative returns. So we can see that there isn't really that much of a benefit for investing into long high ESG and short low ESG, and we'll get into that a little bit later once we look at the other graphs. Next slide, please. So yeah, as you can see here, this is the 3-year span of all providers together, and Bloomberg Sustainalytics once again have the negative cumulative returns over the past 3 years. But for S&P Global, we observed a little bit of increase in cumulative returns. Next slide. Okay, so as you can see here, we essentially split up the portfolio into long high ESG and also long low ESG instead of short ESG, just to see which parts of the portfolio outperformed one another. And we'll get into the long low ESG after this, but the long high ESG performed relatively well. We can see that there is a cumulative increase for the alphas of the portfolios for Bloomberg and Sustainalytics over the past 10 years on the left side. And on the right side, you can see pretty much the same thing for all 3 of the data providers. One thing that we did observe, though, was in between 2011 and 2012 on the left graph, you can see that there is a little bit of a jump for the Bloomberg high ESG portfolio. And essentially, we haven't really figured out the exact reason behind that, but our best educated guess would be that one of the companies in the high ESG portfolio had performed very well that day, and that's why that jump occurred. And because of the weighting system, the higher the ESG is, the more of the weightage of the portfolio that it'll take up. So that's why that jump might have occurred. But after that, as you can see, it pretty much stabilizes. Great. And so finally, we have our long low ESG, and this is where we see the rationale behind why our total portfolio had a negative cumulative return. And that's because the long low ESG outperformed the long high ESG. And although the graph on the left looks pretty much the same, the axes are a bit different. So for the previous slide, the axis went up about like 0.5 for each increment, but here we can see goes up by 1s for each increment. And that basically just shows that the cumulative returns over the past 10 years are essentially double with the low ESG portfolio as opposed to the high ESG portfolio. And again, pretty much the same results on the right side with all 3 data providers. We have a more significant increase in the value of our portfolio for 2017 to 2019. Next slide, please. Okay, so getting into our robustness checks, there are several things that we incorporated throughout our research process here, and we would like to keep developing for future, if we did do this in the future. First of which is using more data. We would like to include stocks from other sources in the US, mainly Europe, where ESG is a more of a mainstream idea. And we can use different rating sources as opposed to 3 that we've used for this research project. And once we have more of that data, we can vary the number of stocks in each portfolio and play with the weightings a little bit more as well. One thing we would continue to do is use both the Farmer-French 3-factor regression model and 5-factor regression, just so we can incorporate the results of profitability and investment into our thesis. After that, we would continue to use the both long high ESG and long low ESG only portfolios, in addition to the combined long short portfolio, to make sure that we can kind of look at which portions of the portfolio outperform one another. And finally, we'd like to incorporate an additional robustness check for the future to conduct a cross-sectional regression for each time period for the ESG risk factor, just so we're making sure controlling for all of the variables.
As ESG investment is a relatively new idea, we believe that there is room for further exploration in the subject area as well. Some other research paths that could be taken in the realm of ESG is whether we could extract the more unbiased ESG risk premium from noisy ESG ratings across different rating providers. We also want to look into how ESG risk factors change if we change the portfolio construction. How can long-run climate shifts, so an increase in global temperature, an increase in sea levels and CO2, how could that affect the ESG risk premium? And also focusing on individual aspects within environmental, social, and governance. Do some of those factors of ESG provide a higher risk premium than other factors within ESG? And then specifically within the governance factor, how strong or weak is the correlation between CEO compensation and stock performance? With that, we conclude our presentation. Thank you all for your time.
thank you to the asset pricing cohort for their presentation. I think the next presentation is the game theory baseball talker. Be able to share slides.
Yeah. So can you see the screen? I will assume you can. So this presentation is from half of the game theory cohort. So from Jim, David, Oliver, and myself. Unfortunately, our cohort leader became unavailable to meet with us starting at a point earlier in the spring. So this presentation is a little non-traditional. Nonetheless, it's our best attempt at using game theory to try and determine what fraction of Major League Baseball's pitchers are sticking to traditional baseball strategies versus embracing more modern strategies. So to briefly elaborate on that title slide, so we're considering a modern pitching strategy to essentially mean playing a mixed strategy. So mixed strategy dictates that the pitcher on each pitch will choose their pitch type randomly. So this implies that each pitch would essentially be independent of the last. So even if a given pitch type gets clobbered for a home run in a certain at-bat, a pitcher playing a mixed strategy would not change the probability with which they throw that pitch in the next at-bat against that same batter. So traditional baseball logic is something different. It's a strategy that dictates that the outcome of the previous at-bat affects the pitcher's pitch choice in the subsequent at-bat. So the logic goes, if a pitcher chooses a certain pitch type and say it gets clobbered for a home run, the pitcher will be more likely to shy away from using that pitch type in the next at-bat against that batter. So as far as our application of game theory, each pitch is what we call a strategic game between the pitcher and batter. So for our project, we're analyzing a certain type of this game. So essentially two pitches in two separate at-bats between the same batter and pitcher in the same baseball game. More specifically, we're analyzing the pitcher's choice of pitch type on the last pitch of the first at-bat compared to the choice of pitch type on the first pitch of that next at-bat against the same batter. So to connect this idea back to the two strategies I mentioned earlier, for a modern mixed strategy, the outcome of the last pitch in the first at-bat we're considering would not change the probability with which a pitcher would throw a given pitch type to open up the second at-bat we're considering. And for a traditional baseball strategy, the probability that the pitcher chooses the same pitch type for the first pitch in the second at-bat will be lower if the batter performed well against that pitch type in the first at-bat compared with a scenario in which the batter did not perform well against that pitch type in the last pitch of the first at-bat. So as far as our data set goes, luckily, Major League Baseball is really into advanced statistics. So they've cataloged every pitch, including pitch type and outcome since 2008. So we will use the StatCast search application to sort of specify what data we want to use from this giant data set. So as we sort of mentioned earlier, the idea of our project is to focus on many instances of the same pitcher and batter facing off in at least in two at-bats in the same game. And we will only be considering situations in which there are no runners on base when that happens, which will ensure that our payoff matrices and player incentives are as constant as possible in all the scenarios we consider. So we're going to model this game using the min-max decision rule. So we're creating separate sets of payoff matrices for the modern mixed strategy and for the traditional strategy. So this slide is for the modern strategy. As you can see, we have two payoff matrices that represent that strategy as we're sort of analyzing it. And the left-hand matrix is for the last pitch of the first at-bat. The right-hand matrix is for the first pitch of the second at-bat. So to keep our model pretty simple, we're considering two broad pitch types, so a fastball and an off-speed pitch. And in each matrix, the columns dictate the pitch type that the batter anticipates, and the rows show what pitch the pitcher chooses to throw. So if the batter guesses correctly, if his anticipation aligns with what's actually thrown by the pitcher, we assume that that results in a hit, which is a negative payoff for the pitcher and a positive payoff for the batter. And if the batter guesses incorrectly, that does not result in a hit, and the pitcher is rewarded with a positive payoff, and the batter gets a negative payoff. And these payoff results are shown by the variable pairs in each box of each matrix. And just as a note, below the matrices, we've assigned the variable P to be the probability that the pitcher throws a fastball. And for some simplicity, probability that the pitcher throws an off speed, we're assigning as 1 minus P, which will be important in the coming slides.
Yeah, so a little more on those values of P and 1 minus P. So as Matt said, we are using the Minimax theorem to determine what the optimal behavior is going to be in the strategic game. And what that theorem tells us is that in a zero-sum game where the payoffs to one player are the opposite of the payoffs to the other player, essentially what one player wants to do is choose a mixed strategy that will minimize the best result the other player can get from their mixed strategy. So hence Minimax, because here our row player is trying to minimize the maximal value of an expected payoff that the other player can get. And so using this approach, we're able to solve for what the probabilities the pitcher would use in terms of the different payoffs in our matrix. And I'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation about how we were planning to calibrate those payoffs. For now, it's all going to be general, as you see here. But the important thing is game theory provides a mathematical foundation to solve this model and get actual values for P, 1 minus P. And then here I also have a variable representing how likely the batter is to anticipate a fastball or an off-speed pitch. And that's governed by Q and 1 minus Q. So if we go to the next slide, I'll also get into what the traditional approach would be. And we thought about some different ways that we could set this up. But what we decided was under the modern school of thought, the payoff matrix doesn't change from the first pitch to the second pitch. And the assumption there is with as much scouting as goes on in Major League Baseball, you pretty much know how effective your pitcher is at throwing a fastball or an off-speed pitch, and you know how effective each particular batter is at responding to a fastball or an off-speed pitch, which means that even if, as Matt said, you hit a home run on a fastball on the first pitch, the pitcher really shouldn't change the strategy because you have so much more information besides that one event to go off of when thinking about how to play this strategic game. But under the traditional thinking, you react to that immediate information and update the payoff matrix. And so in this case, when the batter hits a fastball, we see from the pitcher's perspective, the payoff matrix in the second game, which is the matrix on the right, is updated so that throwing a fastball and having the batter anticipate the fastball correctly becomes more damaging to the pitcher because it seems more likely that the batter is going to hit it, and even worse, maybe hit it for a home run. And what that will deliver in the model is that now the probability of throwing a fastball under optimal play will decrease by some epsilon for the pitcher, and the chance of throwing an off-speed pitch in the optimal mix strategy is going to increase. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see the derivation of that. Essentially, all of this is going to work the same way as it did on the last slide. Just applying the Minimax theorem, we solve this problem using the arbitrary values in the payoff matrix. The important thing here is now, again, the coefficient on A is some K greater than 1 because the pitcher is now weighting that outcome as worse than it was before based on the information from the first pitch. So those are the two competing models. Then we were going to go to the data. And on the next slide, I can take you through how we were planning to go about this. Like Matt said, there is a wealth of data about pitches from the last 12 years or so of Major League Baseball. And so we were going to calibrate the first pitch model, which is the same across both the traditional and the modern approach, using just the percentages of pitches of each type, fastball and off speed, that are thrown on the last pitch of the first at bat in our sample. And so then we solve using actual values for payoffs that would deliver the percentages we observed in the data. And after that, we were going to see whether the traditional school of thinking or the modern school of thinking is holding in baseball by breaking down the data for the second pitches, the pitches on the second at bat, based on what pitch was thrown originally, and then whether that pitch was hit in our first sample. And so by testing whether those percentages are different in each of those cases, so for example, in the case where the first pitch was a fastball, it was hit, and now you're receiving a pitch on the next at bat, Are those percentages different? Is the percentage of fastballs coming to the batter lower? And if so, if we find that there's a statistically significant difference in the data, that would have confirmed that pitchers are still adhering to the conventional thinking rather than the modern statistical thinking, that you should just play your mixed strategy every time without changing it based on what happened in the first pitch. And that would have aligned with what we were expecting based on what happened in the literature, because a lot of similar results in tennis and also some in baseball and professional football suggest that that immediate feedback has too strong an influence on decision-making in professional sports. So as Matt said, we weren't ultimately able to do that because our cohort leader was unfortunately not available to help us walk through this project for most of the spring quarter. But this is hopefully giving you an idea of the path we would have taken and the results that we might have received. And with that, we really appreciate your time and attention.
The next cohort to go is the Brazil topic from the development cohort.
Good evening. Can you see my screen? But I guess that's a yes. Okay.
It's still loading.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, I can see it now.
Okay. Well, good evening. We're the development cohort, and this presentation is regarding the research from half the cohort, which is me, composed by me, Sartak, and Dipro, and Becky, who is our cohort leader. Unfortunately, wasn't able to be present now, but our research was regarding a recent economic policy in Brazil and its effects among 13 different industries throughout 12 states in the country. Basically, the economic policy was somehow similar to the American policy of stimulus checks. So basically in March, Brazilian government decided to implement this policy that would distribute around $112, 600 reais, to specific demographics, which were defined by, were somehow underprivileged or in economic situations that were a little bit more sensible, which are people older than 18 years old, for exception of teenage mothers, had no active formal employment or were informal workers, and there were also income limitations, and these prerequisite that they were not supposed to already be included in other programs for economic assistance from the government. The initial law was put in practice in April and established 3 months of this aid, of this deposit of $112, but due to the pandemic and the increase in COVID cases, it was actually extended to 5 months. And in September, a second law actually also established additional 4 months, but it decreased the original value to half the original amount, therefore to $56. And recently in March, another law was also established, implementing additional 4 months of an even lower value of $47. Our research was regarding the year of 2020, specifically the first amount of 600 reais or $112. And we aim at establishing a data regression that had the focus of trying to establish eventual correlations between better or risk performances in sales of specific industries throughout the country, and specific patterns in distribution, in this income distribution established by the policy. The data was actually found in all the data was actually found in a specific data set from the Brazilian government, and we picked 12 specific states that were the most relevant in economic and social terms in the country. and 13 industries. We had access to data from November of 2019 to February 2021. And however, we weren't able to actually perform the data regression yet. But we aim at doing that in the next few days. And our overall focus is actually to establish any correlations that might lead to some justifications or reasons of better performances in these specific industries, these 13 industries, and we chose very diverse industries in order to actually be able to perform a more accurate regression and, well, a specific distribution of DA in those 12 specific states in the country. And why we weren't yet able to perform the regression, we aim at doing that in the next few days. And, well, try to establish any possible hypothesis based on the data results that we will find. And yeah, but those were the 12 states and those were the 13 industries that we chose. And we will be performing the regression in the next few days. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do it in time for the presentation. But that is basically our research question and project. And I believe I actually have a slide for questions, but I don't think those will be addressed now. But yeah, I look forward to answering your questions soon.
Awesome, thank you. So the next cohort is the other half of the development cohort, the trade topic.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen.
Okay, so hi guys. We're the other half of the development cohort, and our group consists of me, Ziz, and Neil, who couldn't make it today, and we were led by Majda, who was kind of our mentor. So we were looking specifically at trade liberalization and global health. And kind of a middle part of that would be, we were talking about food consumption as well. So yeah, next slide, please. Okay.
Right.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So for some background info and motivation. So just to start with, we actually looked at the data set that we used last year for a different topic. So there was a lot of data that we were interested in exploring. So we kind of recycled that data and used it for new purposes. That's really the main motivation for this project, just exploring a new topic with no data set. In any case, some background information on this particular topic. We considered a range of literature on trade and health outcomes in developing countries, and some important findings that are relevant, although not directly related to our topic, which is actually not very well researched. But yeah, some related research indicates that trade liberalization has significant effects on child mortality rates. Like there is a robust correlation there given a set of controls. Although we have to keep in mind that declining child mortality rates were also correlated with democratization, where liberalization, like trade liberalization, didn't go hand in hand with democratization. Trade liberalization alone did not have a robust correlation with health outcomes, specifically child mortality in this case. And another piece of literature we looked at was the fact that government assistance to agricultural trade has a small but significant effect on the nutritional outcomes of children, especially children from low-income households. And this is a study in a more recent study, actually, that was published in 2019. So in general, looking at several different pieces of research, and as well as consulting Professor Menendez, who came in to talk about like trade with us. Like she mentioned that the global north is relatively self-sufficient in agricultural trade. So like generally speaking, agricultural trade actually holds very few advantages for the global south. And as a result, like unless we're looking at certain commodity exports such as cotton, rice, and soybeans or sugar, it's generally going to be difficult to argue that trade liberalization alone can have a major impact on health outcomes. So yeah, that's the background research.
And so some other research that we did in terms of some other papers that we had read is that in general, consumption has been shifted away from more regional diets towards stuff that you're getting from international trade and more between different states. And along with, so we were looking specifically at India and about the liberalization of trade that happened during the 1990s. And there were a couple different papers that talked about how consumption changed during that time and how there's the decline in cereal intake, increase in vegetable, fruit, and meat consumption. And then along with that, there was an increase in obesity and other some chronic diseases, including diabetes, and then also cancer on the rise that had to do with this increase of available food sources, as well as more fast food that's coming into some of these places.
Right, so a little bit about our data sources. So in particular, we consider two different sets of data. They're both from a broader category that's known as the India Human Development Survey, which was carried out during two different periods. The first survey was conducted from 2005 to 2006, and it involved just a little over 40,000 households and over 200,000 individuals, as well as 1,000 variables, just a little over that. And the second survey is about the same. There were a few different variables that were considered this time around, but overall, there was roughly the same number of households interviewed, not necessarily the same households, which is an issue that we might discuss later, but it's worth pointing out over here that that's something that we are still thinking about, like consulting with the collectors of the data, just to ensure that the households being surveyed are the same ones. And then about 200,000 individuals are surveyed during the second survey as well. So that's our data. Right, and as for our model in particular, at the moment, we're just looking at consumption and health outcomes at the individual level, like in India. Even though like our ultimate goal is to build a conclusion, about how trade might impact health outcomes. At this point, we're still looking for an intermediate connection that will allow us to derive that conclusion. So right now we're looking at consumption patterns and how they correlate with different health outcomes. And then from there, the second half of our project, which we will complete, hopefully, of course, given the next 3 weeks, is to look at how trade and like specifically agricultural exports and imports that will affect or correlate with specific consumption patterns. And after we have established like consumption patterns and their correlations with health outcomes, we're hoping that along the way we will be able to construct a more coherent link between trade and health outcomes. So yeah, in short, at the moment, our only dependent variables, short-term morbidity over the past 30 days, although there are a few other variables that we want to consider too within the individual health category. This is the one that we have in our model at the moment. And then we have 13 other variables, which we're looking at, and both controlling, this includes both our control variables as well as the variable that we really care about, which is like, in particular, we're looking at food items and their consumptions, but also like kerosene, clothing, footwear. The others are mainly controls. So income is a big factor, literacy, as you will see in the next slide when we will actually show you our regression tables. So these are all pretty important. Although, yeah, the focus here is we're looking at consumption really. So food items, kerosene, and inpatient, outpatient care, as well as clothing and footwear. Those are variables that we're really focusing on. And yeah, we will probably be adding more variables with time. And yeah, so here's the regression table from our first survey. And although right now the table is a little bit hard to interpret, so we're thinking about using log regression instead of just a simple linear model, which is what we have right now because we only started manipulating the data very recently. But yeah, that should be done in the next few days, actually. Yeah, and here's our table from the second survey. And yeah, in particular, we have an R squared of about 0.017 and a residual error about 1.733. And yeah, with a few variables in particular that we want to really look into, including like rice, milk, outpatient care, and inpatient care. So these are all significant, although we were hoping that there would be more significant correlations. It appears that these are the ones that we will focus on in the coming weeks. Yes. So yeah, here's a summary of essentially what we want to do as we move ahead to make sure that our estimations and robustness of our data are considered. So firstly, we want to make sure that we're removing outliers from the data. Right now, we don't have a lot of outliers, but yeah, there are a few outliers, especially since we've combined household data with individual data. There might be some errors in that area, which we need to consider. And then we also need to look at more consumption variables and remove missing data, which might also be a factor in why our coefficients are actually pretty low at the moment. Yeah. And then we also want to double check that household parameters are adjusted in accordance with the household size. So this once again has to do with the fact that we recently combined household data with individual data, and some parameters, for example, like household income, needs to be divided among each household member when we're looking at the individual data. And as for the limitations and directions for further work, so some major obstacles that we're facing right now is that we don't actually have disaggregated data on trade below the national level. So even though the data we have right now is at the individual level, when we actually look at tariff rates or other trade data, we're going to be looking at that at the national level. So we might need to find a way to work around that. And then we also have the difficulty of establishing the connection between health and trade due to the need to account for second order controls. And we're really trying to say that like health outcomes may be correlated with trade, but in the process, trade might also affect other factors besides consumption, which might be correlated with health outcomes. So that's something we need to double check and really think about, just to make sure that our method is valid. And then we also want to double check on certain variables like literacy with census data, which we do actually have, just because there's always the possibility of inaccurate reporting in surveys. And sometimes people will not report like the truth for various reasons, I suppose. Yeah. And then some interesting questions that we want to explore would include like how geography and industry affect health outcomes. So that's pretty important, especially in light of the fact that we're looking at health outcomes and like individual data, which actually there's state level information included in that. So we can actually look at how different states in India correlate with the average health outcomes of households. And then because we have a pretty balanced distribution of data points, like between the different states, although the more populous states definitely have more data points, like, but generally it's pretty balanced. So because of that, we can kind of look at this question. And then we also want to look at how our controls correlate with one another. Just some additional robustness checks. And that's about it for our group for now.
Awesome, thank you. So next is the Econ of Crime cohort.
I'll try to share my screen. Sorry, were we able to see it? I'm a little confused.
We were.
It was there, but then you since stopped.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try again. Is it good now?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so we're the Econ of Crime cohort, and our research question very broadly is whether or not police presence has a causal effect on the amount of crime in an area. Obviously, this is tackling the issue of reverse causality, because if you simply run a regression against or run a regression relating the amount of crime against the size of a locality's police force or the amount of people, the amount of police on the street, you'll probably see a positive relationship, but it's really impossible to tell, you know, which is causing which. Is it caused, is the rise in crime caused by the city in some way having more police on the streets, or is it the fact that there's more crime that's causing the city to respond by increasing police presence?
So the context that allows us to determine the causality between police presence and crime is the DHS terror alert levels, because an increase in police presence as a result of an increase in the terror alert level is independent of crime level. And so this allows us to determine the direction of the causality. So prior research that helped form our research paper or project is Click and Tabarak in 2003 used the terror alert levels as an exogenous increase in police presence within the Washington, D.C. Area. Levitt in 1997 used a different exogenous increase, which was mayoral election. And then Ditella, Raphael, and Shargodsky used police presence after a terror attack as an exogenous increase. So we're basing our paper off of these prior works.
Yeah, so our goal with this was to emulate the Click and Tabarak paper and essentially attempt to replicate their findings. We used data from the city of Chicago because that was the most readily available for the time period that these terror alerts were changing. We used two general theoretical models. The first one encompassed daily sort of aggregate crime data from all across the city. And we looked at relationships between the level of crime and whether or not we were at an elevated terror alert status CTA ridership, which indicates essentially the amount of people on the streets on a given day, and also fixed effects for month and year. We also looked at interactions between the day and also the part of the city that crimes were taking place in. So we denoted police districts 1 and 18 as being downtown, and we looked at indicators as to whether or not a district is in the downtown area, and essentially crossed that with the elevated terror alert data. And we also once again looked at ridership and month and year fixed effects.
So the data sets that we used were from the CPD crime database, and this has data available from 2001 all the way to present day, but we used a subset of that data from March 12th, 2002 to December 31st, 2005. And because this includes crime and crime type, date committed, and district, we could narrow it down further. We excluded certain types of crimes that wouldn't be seen on the streets, that wouldn't occur on the streets, so they wouldn't really be affected by an increase in police presence on the streets. And these included deceptive practice, gambling, interference with police officer, and other offenses. And then our second data set was the DHS terror alert level, which gave us dates for when the terror alert level would actually be increased to a higher level. And then CTA ridership provides an indicator of how many people were actually out on the streets during a given day. And we use the same exact dates from the terror alert levels and our CPD crime databases.
Yeah, so this is a map of the various Chicago police districts. Obviously, you see us in Hyde Park, but there's many others. And the ones we specifically focused on as being downtown, as we define them, were 1 and 18. They're the districts that encompass much of the loop. And essentially, they would be the districts that would see the greatest surge in police presence during elevated terror levels.
And here's our regression result. This table shows the result for our first specification, which is in which the dependent variable is the daily number of cases across the entire Chicago city. As you can see, the estimator for high alert is negative 18.83 in the first column, and kind of decreases to negative 12 to the third column when we bring in other controls and time fixed effects. So in that sense, we are getting the right direction, that when the alert level is orange as opposed to yellow, there's an associated decrease in the number of cases across the city. However, as you can see, the standard error is kind of large, and also this is not statistically significant at the 0.05 level. And this is the second table, which is the result for our second specification. And this time we have more observations because the dependent here is the total number of cases each day in a particular district, as you just saw in the map what those districts are. Again, we get negative coefficients for both high alert cross downtown and high alert cross not downtown. But again, the p-value is kind of large and we don't really have significance here.
Yeah, so I think the problem with this insignificant result is that Chicago just might not be as sensitive to terrorist attacks as like other cities, maybe New York, London, Paris, Beijing, etc. Because like maybe Chicago is just not a prime target for terrorists, or maybe the Chicago police force is already like overstretched, that it would not be able to respond to these alerts by putting more police officers on the street. And I think the reason that Click and Tabarrok got their conclusion correct is that they focus on Washington, D.C., which is obviously very sensitive to terror alerts. And it had been, unfortunately, the target of terror attacks, in the serious terror attacks in the past. So it does make more sense there. And secondly is methodologically, we hope that we could actually procure data on the actual number of police officers present on the streets each day, so we can conduct a proper two-stage least square analysis rather than this like sort of simple direct regression. If we do that, we can provide a quantitative as well as qualitative conclusion, i.e. like how much crime is reduced when you put one extra police officer on the street, or like one police officer per 1,000 resident or something like that. Then secondly, we can also more reliably test the first stage. Like currently, we are not even sure that the Chicago police actually responded to these terror alerts. And having the police officers' data would definitely help with this. Yep. Thank you. That's it.
That's it. Thank you.
Awesome. So next is the other half of the game theory cohort.
Just a second. I'm trying to. Okay. So hi everyone, we're the second team of the Game Theory Cohort. We're going to present our research on whether misinformation can make players in a game theory game learn slower. And my team members are going to present this, and they're Jack, Alexa, Zach, Robert, and Bradley and Nathan.
Yeah, so what we specifically want to research is whether we can influence participants' ability to learn by introducing misinformation in a public goods game. So what is a public goods game? So basically the classic version is that some number of players all get an endowment of tokens, and they can choose to contribute some amount of their tokens to a public pot, which then gets multiplied and redistributed evenly amongst everyone. In our case, we have 5 participants in each game, with the multiplier being 1.5, and the Nash equilibrium is for everyone to contribute 0 tokens to the public pot. So our experiment has participants run through multiple iterated rounds of this game, and from previous studies, we know that players usually gradually converge to the Nash equilibrium of giving 0 as they learn from repeated rounds. So usually they'll contribute lower and lower amounts until they hit 0. We want to see whether we can introduce misinformation through frameworks of generosity and selfishness to influence each participant's learning and see if they take longer to converge to the Nash equilibrium. Next slide.
Okay, so in terms of literature review, what our team did was look through previous research to establish what we like, what's known and what needs to be focused on. Ultimately, we determined on our research topic how misinformation affects convergence to Nash equilibrium. And so how we got to this conclusion is clear as shown. So in previous research, variables like explicit values, which are just like numbers shown to participants, cognitive reflection and intuition quotients, which is a long way of saying how likely are participants to look for the right answer instead of the easy answer. And then of course, demographic information. Alternatively, variables we used in our research, we used generosity and selfishness statements. So statements like somewhat selfish, somewhat generous over the place where participants were able to choose contributions to the public pot. And so eventually, as shown here, previous research sought to quantify like the effect of social effects, like inequity aversion and altruism, alongside different types of cooperation in participants. And so this divergence is made especially clear with what we measured, which were the amount of rounds it took for players to reach that Nash equilibrium choice of 0 donation. And so the number of rounds it took to happen, if it did at all happen, and the average contribution per round and change between rounds. Next slide.
Right, so as Zach mentioned before, we wanted to test whether misinformation had an effect on average contribution per round and the number of rounds it took for a participant to learn. Because of COVID, running a live game wasn't super feasible, so we simulated the game through a Qualtrics survey. And our misinformation was inserted within the explanation of the survey and as labels for each round, as you'll see in the next slides. And our metrics consisted of the aforementioned average contributions in rounds. So, okay, on the left, we have the control group's introduction, and the right has the treatment group. You can see that for the treatment group, we framed the experiment as an exercise in generosity and implied that it was worse to not share tokens with others. So hopefully that would kind of nudge them towards not contributing 0 tokens. Next slide. And we also inserted labels on token contributions, with contributing less being framed as selfish and contributing more being labeled as generous. So those 2 elements were basically the main ways we decided to implement misinformation. Next.
And after collecting our data, we did some exploratory analysis regarding the average contribution as well as the average number of rounds that the contribution dropped to 0 and stayed at 0. And in the graph on the left, we could see that the average contribution for the control group was around 40, whereas the average contribution for the treatment group was around 50. And in terms of the average number of rounds that the Nash equilibrium was reached, it was around 9.1 in the control group and a little bit above 10 in the treatment group. And note that we count this number as 11 if the contribution never dropped to 0. And looking at the 2 graphs, we could see that, the average contribution and the average number of rounds that Nash equilibrium was reached were both higher in the treatment group, which was as we expect, but the difference observed was not as significant as we expect.
All right, so for related to data analysis, we've constructed several multiple linear regression models of the data, with the predictors being 2 indicator variables on gender and education, as well as whether or not the individuals were either in the treatment or the control group. In addition, we had 3 different response variables, 1 for each of the regression models, those being the average amount of money contributed per round, the average decrease of money obtained per round, and the average contribution in the last 5 rounds.
So what we found out was that for our results for the average amount of money contributed per round and average decrease per round, they're both non-significant. However, our average contribution in the last 5 rounds was significant with a p-value of 0.03. However, when we accounted for gender and education, our p-value increased to 0.12, which made it non-significant.
Next slide.
Yeah, so just to recap, we investigated how misinformation can influence player behavior in the public goods game. We used it because it has a well-defined Nash equilibrium and a relatively well-studied player behavior in its normal configuration. And our analysis shows that despite having an observable difference in the mean contributions and mean number of rounds to reach Nash equilibrium, the p-values and standard error shows that it is largely not caused by the misinformation element. And the limitation to our study is that the online survey collection format is definitely not ideal. The public goods game is best studied in an interactive in-person setting, and our N is relatively small. So future study, they could incorporate in a more robust setting and have possibly more dimensions of misinformation and have possibly more data. But I think our research did add value in that we investigated possibilities of studying misinformation, the effect of misinformation in game setting.
Yeah, I think that's it for our team presentation.
Awesome, thank you. And then last but definitely not least, we have our policy and growth cohort. Should be able to share screen.
All right, I'm Vaughn Richard. I'm with the Policy and Growth cohort headed by Emma and Alan. And we looked at the effects of COVID-19 on bank deposits. This was done by Beth Ling and I. So the motivations for this, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was a huge spike in bank deposits in all countries around the world. So we thought this was interesting and looked to analyze what caused this. COVID was a very unique economic event, unlike other like downturns in the past. It was very just first time that like that widespread of lack of mobility had happened. So looking at people's behavior in this and learning from it would be a very valuable tool. So yes, our research question is, what explains the spike in bank deposits in 2020 across different countries? This is an example of what we observed. So as you can see, it's not scaled to 0, but obviously there's a rapid uptake right around March, April, right when the COVID pandemic first hit the United States. This was reflected in many countries around the world. So for relevant literature, we looked at certain articles, such as one from the European Central Bank. They talked about how forced savings lead to future consumption. So basically forced savings is when people are forced to put their money in the bank. They'd rather spend it, but due to some circumstance, they're not able to. So if this was the case, then we'd expect to see a larger recovery once people are able to move around and spend their money more. We looked at how did US consumers use their stimulus payments, because I guess this comes later, but we basically looked at like what variables we think could have caused this. So we thought either stimulus, lack of mobility, or government monetary policy. We looked at those as the causes. So we looked at this article because it said that basically the stimulus checks ended up being more forced savings. So that led to us, that led to some of our theorizing. And then, and then just looking at past examples of the Great Recession, saw that there were some precautionary savings. So we thought that could have happened with COVID. There was much uncertainty back in March and April when people knew very little about COVID. So they could have also been saving up for the future. For data sources, again, we ran our regression on, so independent variables are savings. We had fiscal policy, interest rates, and COVID mobility as our dependence and GDP as control. COVID mobility was very useful as it was an extensive database of many countries throughout the world about just how mobile people were, where they were visiting. So if people were more in their houses, we'd be able to know. Interest rates, we theorized that would lead to more savings as people get more return on their money. And fiscal policy, that was, I figure if people are getting stimulus checks, then they would likely save more money, have more money in their bank accounts. So for regression, we did multiple linear regression on these variables. Savings, stimulus were given as billions, interest rates and mobility data were given as percentage. Our results were here. We found that residential and workplace mobility were significant. The fiscal response was significant, and the interest rates were significant. Now, this obviously shows correlation. You would not want to use this for causation, for example. Like just because interest rates is very significant, had a very large effect. That was because when the panic hit, the economic panic hit, every country just instantly reduced their rates. And it's very unlikely that was the only cause, or that likely led to some more savings, but that was likely not the only effect. But that's just like a basic response that countries do when there's economic panic. So essentially, no causation here. I guess, another interesting thing is the fiscal response had a negative coefficient, so more government spending equaled less savings. That is very surprising, as you'd expect when the government hands out money to people, they'd have more in their bank accounts, they'd have more money on hand. So likely this would require more research, but likely what happened there was a lag effect. I'd say the government likely started handing out money while the pandemic panic was going on. People were going out, spending their money, shopping, buying, stocking up. And then it was in those next few months that savings actually started increasing because there was lack of mobility. And that is reflected again in the average residential. There's a very large coefficient on the average residential. So when when more people were in their houses, there was a much larger saving increase. So yes, so our data points towards it was more of an effect of the lack of mobility. Also, side note on this, we had to use the discount rate for countries, as there just unfortunately wasn't data set on bank interest rates. So that's why it's negative. When the discount rates went down, that means, able to save more. And then limitations moving forward. In the future, we would like to compare it to more countries. The data definitely seems skewed towards larger economies, given that intercept. There were some smaller European countries I think didn't fit the model very well. Limitations of our data, it was monthly, and I think like at the beginning of that March kind of panic, that's when people were spending a lot. Towards the end, that's when the government stimulus started coming out. That's when people started going into isolation more. So we weren't, I feel like weekly data perhaps would have produced better results, but that was the limitations of what we had. Also, again, we would have liked to have like bank interest rates, not discount rates, but fortunately there was no database for that. And again, in the future, maybe perhaps you could look for a causation instead of just correlation, but we were unable to do that this time. And yes, that is the conclusion of our presentation. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you to all of the cohorts who have presented and put in such excellent work this year. Going forward, we look forward to seeing your write-ups. And I'm going to stop recording.